What if Rick Sanchez landed in Marvel? The Arctic wind had been screaming for 6 hours before it stopped mattering. Inside Black Site Meridian, 40 meters below the Greenland ice shelf, Maria Hill was doing what she did best, applying precise, measured, technically legal pressure to a man who had made catastrophically poor decisions about which employers to trust. The AIM biochemist's name was Dr. Callum Price. He was 43 years old, had 3 publications in peer-reviewed journals, 2 retracted under pressure he hadn't understood at the time, and 1 ongoing research project that should not have been possible given the current state of human biochemistry. The serum in the cryo container on the table between them had molecular markers Hill's own science team couldn't classify. She needed him to explain what he'd made. He needed her to believe he hadn't made it alone. Neither of them was getting what they wanted. The interrogation suite was clean, white light, recycled air, with that particular stillness that exists only underground, where no wind has ever reached. 6 SHIELD agents arranged in practiced positions around the walls. A two-way mirror that everyone in the room understood existed and pretended they didn't. Hill was 3 questions from the moment Price would break, and she knew it with the same certainty she knew the layout of every exit in a building she'd never visited. Then the air in the center of the room turned green. Not dramatically, not with a crack of thunder or a beam of light, or any of the aesthetic spectacle that SHIELD had learned to associate with incursion events. The air turned green the way a bruise turns color, gradual and then sudden, and something ripped open in the middle of the interrogation suite with the sound of a paper bag being torn by hands that had lost patience, and through it came a man and a half-consumed flask of something luminescent, and then the tear sealed itself with a sound like an afterthought. The man hit the floor in a controlled tumble that suggested either combat training or a lifetime of falling. He came up standing. He looked around the room. 6 weapons were already aimed at him with the disciplined speed of people who trained for exactly this kind of arrival. He looked at the weapons. He looked at the cryo container. He looked at Maria Hill with the particular expression of a man who has been interrupted mid-thought by a reality he hasn't decided to take seriously yet. "Ha," he said. He raised the flask to his lips and drank. "Okay," he said. "Ow." His name was Rick Sanchez. He was, by his own accounting, the smartest being in any universe he had thus far elected to visit. He was wearing a stained lab coat over a shirt that had lost the war against its own existential potential 2 dimensions ago. His white hair stood at angles that suggested the universe's relationship with his grooming preferences was purely adversarial. He was 60-some years old in the timeline that had produced him, older in the timelines he'd moved through, and somewhere between the 2 in the ways that actually counted. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a device the size and approximate shape of a small pistol, except that it was making sounds a pistol should not make, emitting readings on a small display that caused his expression to shift from mild irritation to the specific focus of a man discovering something worth his time. "Don't," said Hill. "Relax," Rick said, not looking at her. "It's a scanner. Although I get it, the gun shape is probably confusing for people whose technology hasn't evolved past the whole, explosive projectile phase of development." He turned in a slow circle, scanner extended. "These readings are genuinely fascinating. Your physics constant is running at a measurably different value than my home universe. That's rare. I've visited about 800 realities and only seen that kind of variation in, he paused, counting internally, 4, 3 of which were actively collapsing at the time, so. He glanced at Hill. "Is this universe collapsing?" "Put the device down," Hill said. "It's not a weapon. Put it down anyway." Rick considered this for 2 seconds, which in his personal time felt considerably longer. Then he set the scanner on the table beside the cryo container. He looked at the container properly for the first time. Something shifted in his expression, the distracted energy sharpening, narrowing. "What's in the box?" he said. It was not a question. "That is significantly not your concern," Hill said. The molecular resonance signature is in a frequency band I've only ever seen in two contexts, Rick said, still looking at the container. And one of them is a class of synthetic serum my own civilization banned after the third planetary extinction event it caused. So either your people stumbled onto something genuinely impressive, or you've got a serious problem in that box, and you're all standing too close to it. He picked up the scanner again. Hill's hand moved. Oh, for the love of, I'm not going to use it on you people. I'm running a containment assessment. He scanned the cryo container. The readings came back. His expression shifted into something that had no clean name, but lived in the territory between impressed and alarmed. Price, who had been entirely forgotten in the last 90 seconds, said quietly, "He's right, about the proximity." Hill looked at the biochemist. She looked at the old man in the stained coat, who had fallen through the air in her interrogation room, and was now apparently conducting his own investigation. She looked at the 6 agents with their weapons still raised. "Everybody back 12 feet, she said. The agents moved. Rick stayed where he was. Hill gave him a look that had ended careers and started wars. 12 feet, she said. "I'm the one who noticed the problem," Rick said, but he stepped back. 14 feet, not 12, because he had already assessed the actual radius, and 12 was insufficient. It was the first time Maria Hill met Rick Sanchez and understood, in the particular hindbrain way she'd developed over a decade of working alongside people who operated at the edge of possible, that the situation had changed in ways she hadn't finished mapping yet. She was right. She didn't know how right yet. She would. The next 40 minutes produced one containment breach assessment that Rick conducted entirely without authorization, but which was, as her science team later confirmed in deeply reluctant reports, accurate to 4 decimal places. 1 flask of substance that her toxicology team would spend 3 weeks trying to classify. 1 thoroughly rattled AIM biochemist who, in the presence of someone who immediately and correctly identified every component of his illegal serum, had the particular emotional collapse of a person who had believed themselves uniquely brilliant, discovering there are worse things than being caught by law enforcement. And 1 scanner reading that Rick pulled up on the cryo container display, that nobody in the room understood, but that he stared at with an expression that was not the expression of a man making a casual observation. It was the expression of a man looking at something that genuinely frightened him. "What is that reading?" Hill said. Rick looked at her, then at the reading, then back at her. "How many of them are there in this universe?" he said. "How many of what?" "The things my scanner just flagged." He turned the display toward her. The readings meant nothing to her. These energy signatures, they're massive. They're operating on a quantum resonance frequency that and here he paused in the particular way of a man who chose his next words carefully, which was rare enough to be notable. "I have never measured anything like this outside the central finite curve. How many are there?" Hill said nothing. Rick looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the reading again. 6, he said. Or was it 6? That's the number I'm getting. 6 distinct signatures that big. He lowered the scanner. His voice had changed register from the performative impatience of a man tolerating lesser company to something quieter and more dangerous. "If I'm reading these correctly, and I always am, someone in this universe has access to 6 objects that each individually constitute a greater concentration of reality-altering entropy than anything I have encountered in 800 universe hops. And they're all in the same place." He looked at the ceiling, calculating. Same solar system, at minimum, possibly the same planet. The room was very quiet. "I need my portal gun back," Rick said. "Not to leave, to figure out how long I'm stuck here." He sat down in the interrogation chair that had, until 8 minutes ago, held Dr. Callum Price, crossed his arms, and waited with the patience of a man who had done a great deal of waiting in a great many unfamiliar rooms. Hill excused herself, walked 4 feet to the hallway, and made 3 calls in under 2 minutes. The first was to Fury, the second was to the science team at Site 7, the third was to a private number she almost never used, because the man who answered it was always 11 steps ahead of any conversation she initiated, and she preferred, when possible, to be at least 8. The number rang twice. "Hill," said Reed Richards, and his voice carried that particular quality of a man already thinking about something else and rearranging that thinking to accommodate her. "I was going to call you. 40 minutes ago, my instruments registered an interdimensional transit event off the Greenland shelf. Whatever came through that aperture was operating on a physics constant I've never measured in this universe." A pause, the sound of equations being reconsidered. "Please tell me you have it in custody." "He's in my interrogation room," Hill said, drinking something bioluminescent and complaining about silicon computing. A longer pause. "I'm on my way," Reed Richards said. The drive from wherever Reed had been to wherever Hill needed him was not short. It gave her time to run the man in her interrogation room through every database SHIELD possessed, which returned nothing useful, which was itself a specific kind of data. It gave her science team time to confirm, with expressions of deep professional discomfort, that Rick's assessment of the cryo container had been correct. It gave Rick time to finish the flask, produce a second flask from somewhere in the coat, and begin what he described as a partial recalibration of his portal gun, using tools he fabricated from components he extracted from what had appeared to be an empty coat pocket, but was apparently operating on a storage principle her team couldn't immediately identify. The portal gun sat on the table. It hummed. The hum was not loud, but it had a frequency that made the overhead lights flicker at irregular intervals, and 2 of her agents reported a sensation they described as the room tilting without moving, which her physics team confirmed was a localized space-time stress response caused by whatever the gun was doing when it tried and failed to find a stable calibration point. "It's looking for my home universe," Rick explained when she pointed this out. "Like a phone trying to find signal. It's not finding it because the physics constant here is wrong, which means it can't build a stable aperture because it's trying to open a door that doesn't fit this frame." He adjusted something on the gun with a tool that seemed to be both larger and smaller than the space it occupied. "It'll take me some time to reprogram it for local conditions. Could be days, could be weeks. Depends on whether I can get equipment." "Equipment," Hill said flatly. "I have a list," Rick said. He produced a list. It was written on the back of what appeared to be a dimensional transit receipt from a civilization that had not existed yet. The items on the list were written in notation her people could not translate, except for 3 entries near the bottom that were in English, which read, "Decent bourbon, not a suggestion," and also, "Better bourbon." Reed Richards arrived 6 hours later. He came through the facility's main entrance with the particular low-key urgency of a man who had spent his life moving quickly through spaces that couldn't contain what he was actually thinking. He shook Hill's hand, took her briefing in the corridor outside the interrogation suite with the rapid, comprehensive absorption of a man who read at speeds that made others uncomfortable, and asked 3 questions whose precision told her he'd already hypothesized 70% of what she was about to show him. Then he opened the door. Rick looked up from the portal gun's innards, which were spread across the table in an arrangement that should not have been physically possible given the external dimensions of the device. He looked at Reed Richards. Reed looked at him. The moment lasted perhaps 4 seconds. "You wrote the 7 theoretical papers," Rick said. Reed stopped. "You found them." "I didn't find them. I ran a standard cross-reference of this universe's theoretical physics literature against my scanner readings in the first 20 minutes I was here, and they came up flagged, because they're the only papers your civilization has produced that are even in the same conceptual neighborhood as what's actually going on with local space-time. And then I found your name on them." Rick pointed at a chair across the table. "Sit down. I have questions about your conclusions in paper 4, specifically your treatment of the boundary condition problem. You were wrong, but the way you were wrong is interesting." Reed Richards sat down. He said, very carefully, "In what way was I wrong?" Rick told him. What followed was 11 hours. Not continuously in the interrogation room, which was eventually abandoned for a larger space when Rick's portal gun components had expanded to cover not just the table, but significant portions of the floor. Hill brought food at hour 2, which neither of them acknowledged. She brought coffee at hour 5, which Rick drank without looking away from a diagram he'd drawn on the wall in marker he'd produced from his coat, and Reed drank while pointing at a specific notation in the diagram and saying, "This isn't possible given the Planck constant in this universe." To which Rick said, "Your Planck constant is slightly off, because you've been measuring it with instruments that assume a static quantum reference frame. Here's how to correct for that. Catch up." And Reed caught up in approximately 45 seconds, which caused a silence that was different from any other silence in the room. It was the silence of a man who had spent his entire life being the fastest person in the room, adjusting. By hour 8 they had filled 2 walls and were working on the third. By hour 9 Hill had stopped trying to follow the content and was instead watching the dynamic with the attention of someone who had spent a long time studying how exceptional people behaved when they encountered each other. By hour 10 they were arguing in a shorthand that had emerged organically from the collision of 2 different but adjacent notational systems, and the argument had the particular quality of combat between people who respected each other's capacity to wound. At hour 11, the markers ran out. Reed produced a pen. Rick produced his flask. They sat in adjacent chairs facing the covered walls and drank in silence for a long time. "Your boundary condition solution is still wrong," Rick said eventually. "I know," Reed said. "I knew when I buried the paper." "Why'd you bury it?" A pause. "Because if the solution is wrong, the implication of the solution might still be right, and the implication terrified me." Rick drank. "Yeah," he said. "It should." They sat with that. "You're planning to leave," Reed said. "That's the working theory." "How long?" "Days, weeks, depends on the equipment." Rick turned the flask in his hands. "Your universe runs hot, more entropy concentrations than I'm used to. 6 objects alone, and they're not even the only sources. I've got your Sorcerer Supreme flagged on the scanner. I've got at least 4 individuals producing quantum resonance signatures that would register as godhood tier in 80% of the universes I've visited, and I've got what I think is a living hive mind operating subcosmically, but with enough mass to be gravitationally significant." He paused. "It's a lot." "Yes," Reed said. "How do you focus here? With all of that going on, the noise." Reed considered this for a moment. "I don't think of it as noise. What do you think of it as?" "I think of it as," Reed paused again, "precisely, the people. The noise is people, the Avengers, my family. Everyone who keeps doing improbable things against impossible odds because they still believe the odds can be beaten." He looked at the wall of equations, at the 2 notational systems interlocked across the white paint. "I don't think of it as a distraction from the real work. I think it's the reason the work matters." Rick said nothing. He drank. "That is," he said finally, his voice carrying something careful and heavily guarded, "a very nice thing to believe." "You don't believe it." "I believe it's a mechanism," Rick said. "I believe it's the most successful self-deception the universe has evolved. Hope, collective investment in outcomes. It's a survival strategy that works well enough in low chaos environments. In a universe this hot, running this much entropy, with 6 reality-altering objects and at least 2 pending extinction-level events I've already spotted in the data," he gestured with the flask. "It's not a strategy, it's a comfort, and comfort is what you reach for when you've decided not to look directly at what's actually out there." Reed looked at him for a long moment. "You've looked directly at it," he said. "I have looked directly at everything," Rick said. "That's the problem." Neither of them said anything after that for a while. It was Loki who interrupted what had become, in the 2 days following the 11-hour session, a fragile and complicated détente. Rick had been established in an auxiliary lab at Site 7, the nearest SHIELD facility that could accommodate both his equipment list and the peculiar space-time stress effects his recalibration work kept producing. The portal gun was on a clean bench, partially disassembled, surrounded by instruments Rick had built from the facility's components, and components he'd built from things that shouldn't have been buildable from what was available. Reed visited twice daily. Hill visited more often than she would have admitted in any official report. Rick worked constantly. He slept in 2-hour increments directly at the bench. He ate without tasting. He was working the way he only worked when something had fully engaged him, and what had engaged him was the problem of threading a portal aperture through a physics constant he'd never navigated before, which was genuinely novel, and novel was the only thing Rick Sanchez truly could not walk away from. The Tesseract's energy signature was visible on his scanners from the first day, a blue line of interference running across every reading he took, constant as a heartbeat and twice as insistent. He'd flagged it and moved on. He was not interested in the Tesseract. The Tesseract was not the problem he was trying to solve. Loki arrived without announcement on the third day. Not physically. The projection that appeared in the corner of the lab had the texture of illusion, layered and smooth, the kind of thing Rick's scanner identified as psychic projection, non-threatening, theatrical, remove unless interesting. Rick looked at the projection for 4 seconds. "Nice trick," he said. "Your actual physical location is about 40 meters northeast, which means you're either in the ocean or there's a structure out there I haven't been briefed on." The projection smiled. It was a very good smile. Loki had been practicing it for centuries. "You are everything the Tesseract's resonance suggested you might be," Loki said. "An intellect that operates entirely outside this reality's established hierarchy. How refreshing, how genuinely rare." "Is the flattery supposed to work?" Rick said. He did not look up from the bench. "Because I am quite literally in the middle of something. I have a proposal. I don't do proposals before I've assessed the proposer's actual capacity." Rick picked up the scanner. He ran it toward the northeast. "Read the return." "Oh," he said. His voice shifted fractionally, interest sharpening. "You're not human." "Decidedly not." "Asgardian." He checked the reading. "Yeah, Asgardian. Your biology is running on a physical substrate that shouldn't be possible in this universe's physics constant, which means you're either from somewhere else originally, or you're operating on stored energy from somewhere with a higher constant." He set the scanner down. "What's the proposal?" Loki's projection settled into a chair that was not real. "The Tesseract is an object of singular significance, a conduit to the Space Stone, which is one of the 6 Infinity Stones your scanner has already identified. Its containment is currently managed by S.H.I.E.L.D. in a manner that is," he paused, finding the word, "suboptimal. I have a design for creating a corridor through the Tesseract's dimensional frequency, a controlled aperture that would allow access to the Space Stone directly." "You want to crack the Tesseract open," Rick said. "In a controlled manner, surgically." "Show me the design." Loki was quiet for a moment, recalculating. He had expected more resistance at this stage, or more enthusiasm. He was not accustomed to being met with neutral request for data. The design appeared in the air between them, a holographic schema. Rick looked at it. He was quiet for 20 seconds. "Page 1, he said. "Page 1, Loki repeated. "The floor is on page 1. Rick reached out and pointed at a specific juncture in the schema. "Here. Your corridor assumes the Space Stone's internal dimensional frequency is stable, but it's not. It's pulsing on a 17-minute cycle, and if you initiate the corridor at any point other than the exact peak of the pulse, the pressure differential between the corridor and the stone's internal space will collapse the corridor inward. Not outward, inward." He paused. "Into you." Loki looked at the schema. He looked at Rick. "You identified that in 20 seconds, he said. "It took me 18 seconds and I spent 2 being polite about it." Rick pulled up his own interface and began typing. "The fix is to synchronize the corridor initiation to the pulse cycle and use the peak pressure as the propulsive force instead of fighting it. You need a timing mechanism accurate to 1/100th of a second and a variable aperture threshold that can expand at the exact rate of the pulse's leading edge. Like this." He turned the interface toward the projection. A corrected schema hovered in the air. Loki was very still. "You just," he said slowly, "fixed my design." "I explained why it was stupid," Rick said. "The fix is a natural consequence of the explanation. I wasn't trying to help you. I was demonstrating the flaw for my own satisfaction. He paused, looking at the corrected schema. Then he looked at the original schema, then back at the corrected one. Something crossed his face. Oh, you have got to be kidding me. What? The corridor geometry in the corrected version. Rick stared at it. It matches the aperture profile I need for my portal gun recalibration. Not exactly. But the dimensional frequency threading principle is directly applicable. He grabbed a physical notepad and began writing. I've been trying to figure out how to thread an aperture through a physics constant. I can't directly measure, and you just handed me the key, by accident, while trying to manipulate me into helping you steal a cosmic artifact. He kept writing, fast. You're not going to help me, Loki said. It was not quite a question. I was never going to help you, Rick said, still writing. Your plan was bad. Now it's technically good, but it's still your plan, and your plan ends with you having access to the space stone, and I've been in this universe for 3 days, and I've already run the probability trees on what happens when any one person in this reality gets unsupervised access to an infinity stone, and the answer is bad, and the answer is always bad, and I refuse to contribute to an outcome that catastrophic even accidentally. He tore the page off the pad and held it up without looking away from the new page he was already filling. Also tell whoever's monitoring the northeastern structure that the Tesseract's pulse cycle is 17 minutes, and they should probably be timing the containment protocols around that. It's probably a known thing, but it might not be. The projection was quiet. You are, Loki said finally, the most genuinely strange person I have encountered in a very long life. Yeah, Rick said. I get that a lot. The projection faded. Rick kept writing. The portal gun on the bench hummed, and the hum had shifted, changed register, found something. He noticed the new hum. He looked at the gun. He looked at what he'd written. He reached over and made a single adjustment to the gun's calibration interface. The hum changed again. The instruments around it registered a space-time stress event that the equipment at Site 7 was not fully qualified to measure. Somewhere in the bedrock of the facility, a hairline fracture appeared that had not existed 12 seconds earlier. It was very small. It was in the rock. Nobody felt it. Hill noticed it on the seismic sensors 40 minutes later, which was when the first call came from Reed Richards, who had been monitoring the portal gun's emissions from his own facility, and whose voice, when he called, was measured and precise, and carrying the particular weight of a man who was about to say something that would change the operational parameters of the last several days. Rick's calibration attempts are producing micro-tears, Reed said. I've been tracking them for about an hour. They're small. Currently they're very small. A pause. The issue is that they're cumulative. Define cumulative, Hill said. Each attempt creates a fractional stress in local spacetime. The stress doesn't fully resolve between attempts. It accumulates. Reed's voice was careful. I need to show you the progression model, but the short version is that if he continues at the current rate, the micro-tears will compound into a larger stress event within a period I'm not yet confident estimating. What kind of larger stress event? Possibly nothing, possibly a localized dimensional fissure, possibly something that draws attention from entities I would very much prefer did not have their attention drawn. Another pause. I'm coming to Site 7. He arrived in 2 hours. He brought his own instruments, which were considerably more sophisticated than Site 7's. He set them up, ran the analysis, and looked at the results for a long time. Rick watched him look. Say it, Rick said. The tiers are currently 6 in aggregate, Reed said, each approximately the size of a quantum filament, immeasurably small by any standard that isn't looking at this data. He turned the instrument display toward Rick, but the rate of accumulation is increasing with each attempt. Because each attempt is more precise than the last, which means each aperture is opening further before it fails, which means each failure produces a proportionally larger residual stress. Rick looked at the data. He looked at it for longer than he usually looked at anything. I was getting closer, he said. Each attempt was closer. Yes, Reed said, the calibration is progressing. But the progression is tearing the space. Yes. Rick was quiet. How long until it's a problem, he said. At the current rate, Reed said, and accounting for compounding, I estimate you have between 11 and 16 attempts before the aggregate stress reaches a threshold that will be difficult to reverse. Beyond that threshold, the tiers will begin attracting each other. Stress events attract each other across dimensional boundaries. When they attract, they compound exponentially rather than linearly. He looked at Rick. Beyond that threshold, I cannot model the outcome reliably. It becomes stochastic. The variables include too many factors I can't quantify. Like what? Like whatever is watching this reality from outside it, Reed said quietly, and what it decides to do when it notices. Rick said nothing for a long time. Then he said, I've noticed something watching from outside actually. On the scanner. It registered in the first 20 minutes, but I flagged it as ambient because the signal was too large to be a local entity. I've been running background analysis on it ever since. He pulled up the scanner data and turned it toward Reed. This thing, what is it in this universe? Reed looked at the reading. That, Reed said, and his voice was very even, is the living tribunal, which is the judge of all things in this universe, the entity charged with maintaining cosmic balance. It operates on a scale that makes the infinity stones look like rounding errors. Rick looked at the scanner. He looked at Reed. He looked at the scanner again. And it's noticed me, Rick said. I think it noticed you the moment you arrived, Reed said. I think it's been waiting to see what you do. He looked at the data. I think the question of what you do next is the question it's waiting to see answered. That evening, Hill called a meeting, not a briefing, not an operational session, a meeting, in a conference room at Site 7 with chairs and a table, and the particular fluorescent lighting that exists in places where serious decisions are made. Present, Hill, Reed Richards. Tony Stark, who had driven up from a Stark Industries meeting in Reykjavik because the words interdimensional transit event and space-time tiers had appeared in the same sentence in the briefing document, and Tony Stark had a documented inability to not be present for things described by those words. Stephen Strange, who was already there when they arrived, because he had been aware of the micro-tiers since the first one, and had been attempting to assess them through sorcerous means for the past 3 days, with results that he described as inconsistent, which was his way of saying they didn't fit any framework he possessed. And Rick Sanchez, who sat at the end of the table with the portal gun in front of him and his flask in his hand, and the expression of a man who was waiting for people to say things he'd already thought past. Hill laid out the parameters. Reed provided the data. Strange described what he'd observed from his own observational frame, which added 3 details that Reed's instruments hadn't captured, and which Rick listened to with the focused attention of someone mentally updating a model in real time. Then Tony Stark looked at Rick and said, So, what's the plan? The plan, Rick said, is that I have between 11 and 16 calibration attempts before the tiers get bad. I need to make each of those attempts count, which means I need the best available data on this universe's physics constant before each attempt, and I need to minimize residual stress between attempts, which means I need a method of partially healing the tiers between calibrations. He looked at Strange. Strange said, the tiers are responding to sorcerous intervention, but not in a consistent way. The energy underlying them is different from anything in my framework. I can work with it, but I'll need time to understand the response pattern. You'll have time, Rick said. The healing attempts and the calibration attempts alternate. You heal between each calibration. We figure out your healing efficacy from the first 2 cycles and adjust the model. Strange looked at Reed. Reed looked at Hill. Tony looked at the portal gun. What about Tony said, and chose the next word carefully, the observer. The living tribunal, Strange said. It's watching, Rick said. I can't make it not watch. What I can do is finish this fast enough that it decides I'm not a systemic threat. He paused. Or I can not finish it, in which case the tiers stay open and the tribunal decides I am a systemic threat, and then all of you have a problem that is significantly larger than me. He looked around the table. Those are the options. The room was quiet. You're telling us, Hill said, that helping you leave is the only way to prevent the alternative. I'm telling you, Rick said, that the math goes one of two ways, and the second way is worse. He drank from the flask. I'm also telling you that I didn't ask to be here. My portal gun misfired during a calibration. I was trying to visit a boring universe and I ended up in yours instead. He looked at the table. If I'd had a choice, I would not have chosen this universe. Tony said, because of the entropy concentrations. Because of the entropy concentrations, Rick agreed, his voice carrying something that was not quite agreement, but wore its shape. And, Reed said quietly, for other reasons perhaps. Rick looked at him. Reed's expression was neutral. Rick looked away. Help me calibrate, he said. Let Strange work on the healing protocol between attempts. Give me 12 working days and I'll be gone, and you'll never have to think about any of this again. Hill looked at the portal gun for a moment, then she said, all right. The 12 days that followed were the strangest 2-week stretch that Site-7 would ever record in its operational history, which was saying something given that Site-7's operational history included 3 Hydra incursions, 1 partial Chitauri artifact activation, and an incident with an Asgardian goat that was still classified at the highest level. Rick calibrated, Strange healed, the tears responded, slowly, then with increasing consistency as Strange learned the pattern of the energy underlying them, developed a notation for the forces involved that was partly his established sorceress framework and partly something new that he built as he went. Reed monitored everything and updated the model after each attempt. Tony analyzed each calibration failure and built a supplementary instrument array that gave Rick 3 additional data points per attempt he hadn't had before. After the first attempt, 1 new tear, Strange healed it in 6 hours, the model updated, Rick slept for 90 minutes and started preparation for the second. After the third attempt, the portal gun achieved a 17-second stable aperture before collapsing. Rick stared at the collapse data for a long time, then made 17 adjustments, none of which he explained to anyone. After the 6th attempt, the aperture held for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Through it, for those 4 minutes, the instruments registered a dimensional signature that Reed recognized from his theoretical papers as a separate physics constant, not Rick's home universe, something in between. You're walking through the realities, Reed said, finding the intermediate steps. The physics constant shift is too large to bridge in one jump, Rick said. I have to do it in stages. Find universes in the gradient between here and C137 and use them as stepping stones. He looked at the collapsed aperture. The problem is, I don't know how many stages there are. Could be 3, could be 40. How many attempts do we have left before the threshold? Reed said. 6, maybe 7, if Strange's healing rate keeps improving. Rick looked at the scanner. I need to hit the right stepping stone on the next try, which means I need better data on the intermediate constants. He turned to Tony. Your multispectral array. Can it be tuned to this frequency band? Tony looked at the band. He looked at the array specs. Give me a day. You have a day, Rick said. Tony Stark built. Rick calibrated his calibration. Strange meditated over the existing tiers with an expression of profound concentration and the particular patience of a man who had learned patience through the repeated experience of being inadequate to what he faced until he was not. Reed updated the model. On the 9th day, Hill found Rick alone in the lab at 3 in the morning. He was not working. He was sitting at the bench, flask in hand, scanner active on the table beside him, staring at the readings it was producing. The readings were not calibration data. They were the ambient readings of the universe around him, the 6 infinity stone signatures, the quantum resonance spikes of the individuals his scanner classified as extraordinary, the constant background noise of a reality that was, as he had said on the first day, running hot. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Can't sleep, she said. I don't sleep, Rick said. I use unconsciousness as a maintenance tool. Different thing. He didn't look at her. Your universe is very loud. You mentioned that. I mean it differently now. He turned the scanner display toward her. It showed, in graphic form, the ambient readings he'd been watching. All of this, the stones, the outliers, your sorcerer, your mechanic, your doctor, all of it making noise. And underneath it, he pointed to a faint consistent line running through every reading. This frequency. Same in every reading, no matter which direction I point the scanner. Like a carrier wave. I've been looking at it for 3 days, and I can't identify the source. Hill looked at the readings. What do you think it is? I think, Rick said carefully, it's the universe believing in itself. He drank, which is insane. Universes don't have beliefs. They have constants and forces and entropy gradients. But this universe runs on something that registers on my scanner like a persistent optimism field, and I don't have a category for that, and that is extremely uncomfortable for me. Hill was quiet for a moment. When was the last time something made you uncomfortable? She asked. This morning, Rick said. When I realized the stepping stone universe I need for attempt 10 is registering in the wrong frequency range and I don't know why yet. He paused. Before that, about 60 subjective years. What was it 60 years ago? A long silence. Someone, he said, just the word, nothing after it. Hill looked at him. He was looking at the scanner. The carrier wave ran through every reading, steady and faint and inexplicable. Reed believes in this universe, she said, not despite knowing what's in it, because of it. I know, Rick said. That's the problem with Reed Richards. He looked at the same data I looked at and drew a different conclusion. And I can't find the flaw in his methodology, only the flaw in his conclusion. He set the flask down. You can't have a correct methodology and an incorrect conclusion. That's not how reasoning works. Which means either his conclusion is correct, or there's a flaw in his methodology I haven't found yet. He looked at the scanner. I've been looking for the flaw for 9 days. Hill said nothing. Go to sleep, Rick said. I'll be here. She left. He stayed. The scanner ran. The carrier wave held steady. Attempt 10 happened on day 10. Reed's model, updated with Tony's spectral array data, had identified 3 candidate stepping stone universes in the intermediate physics constant gradient. Rick selected the one with the highest probability of leading towards C137. He calibrated. Strange stood ready. Tony monitored the tear formation sensors. Reed watched the aperture instruments. Rick pulled the trigger. The portal gun opened an aperture. It held for 30 seconds. Then it found the stepping stone. The aperture shimmered, shifting frequency, threading through the intermediate constant with the precision of a needle through silk. The instruments went wild. The tears formed, not 1 this time, not 2, but 7, simultaneously, as the aperture's attempt to bridge 2 constants at once stressed the local spacetime from 7 angles at once. Strange moved immediately, his hands tracing forms that had no exact parallel in any established framework, working the tears with the tool he'd been building from 9 days of close observation. 5 of the 7 tears responded. The other 2 expanded. Close it, Reed said sharply. Rick closed it. The aperture collapsed. The 2 expanding tears hung in the air, visible now not just on instruments but to the naked eye, hairline fractures in the light itself, where the air looked like old glass. Strange worked them, hard. For 40 minutes, while everyone else watched and said nothing and the instruments measured, and the scanner in Rick's hand showed the living tribunal's ambient signature brightening, fractionally but unmistakably, like attention being redirected. The tears sealed. It took 47 minutes. Rick looked at the scan. He looked at the aperture data. He looked at what the stepping stone attempt had produced. It worked, he said. Partially. I got the thread through the intermediate constant. The collapse was in the aperture architecture, not the frequency threading. I know what the collapse point is now. He was already writing. 2 more attempts, maybe 1, if I get the architecture right on the first try. The tribunal, Strange said. He was breathing harder than usual. The 47 minutes had cost him something. It's closer. Rick looked at the scanner. The signature was brighter. I know. If you open another aperture that produces tears at that rate, Strange said, I don't know if I can close them fast enough. You can, Rick said. You closed 5 of 7 in 47 minutes. At that rate, even if the next attempt produces 10 tears, you'll close them. And if it produces 20? Rick looked at the scanner, at the living tribunal's brightening signature, at the carrier wave, steady as ever underneath everything else. Then, he said, we'll see what happens. The 11th attempt. It was different from the first 10, in ways that every instrument in the room recorded, and that Rick experienced in a way no instrument could capture. It was different because he had all the data he needed. The architecture was right. The stepping stone frequency was threaded. The aperture opened, and it did not collapse at 30 seconds. It held. It held at 30 seconds and at a minute, and at 3 minutes, and the dimensional signature coming through it was correct, pointing toward the next stepping stone in the gradient, and through the aperture, the instruments showed a physics constant that was partway between this universe's value and C-137's, and Rick stood with the portal gun in his hand and looked at what he had built. One more stepping stone after this one, maybe 2. The gun would find them automatically once it had crossed the first bridge. The calibration was done. The work was finished. He could step through, right now. He looked at the open aperture. He looked at the lab, at the covered walls, at the instruments that Reed had brought and Tony had extended, and Strange had learned to read from over 9 days of close work. He looked at the scan running in his other hand, the carrier wave, steady, inexplicable, running through everything. He looked at the aperture. Reed Richards was standing across the lab. He had been standing there since the aperture opened, watching it, watching Rick. Rick looked at Reed. You could study it from the other side, Reed said. The carrier wave. You could take the scanner readings and spend as much time as you needed analyzing them without, as you put it, the noise interfering with the methodology. Yeah, Rick said. But you wouldn't know what was making it, Reed said. Not unless you came back. Rick said nothing. You'd have the data, Reed said, not the answer. The aperture hummed. The instruments read it as stable. Strange was ready. Tony was watching the tear sensors, which showed 2 micro-tears forming at the aperture edges, small, handleable, not yet compounding. Reed, Rick said. Yes. Your conclusion is correct. Reed was very still. The carrier wave, Rick said. I figured out the source. He turned the scanner toward Reed. It's not ambient. It's not a field. It's produced by every individual in this universe who makes a choice that costs them something in the direction of something they can't prove will work. He looked at the data, the quantum resonance signature of unreasonable hope measured against the physics constant of a universe that should be too hot to sustain it. It produces a carrier wave. It has been producing it since before the first stone was placed. He looked at Reed. Your universe runs on it. That's the constant that makes the physics here different from every other universe I've measured. That's what my scanner kept flagging. Not a field. Not an ambient property of the space-time. He looked at the aperture. People. Reed said nothing for a moment. Then he said, quietly, I know. You knew, Rick said. You buried the paper because the implication terrified you. The implication that hope is a measurable physical constant, Reed said. That collective belief in outcomes produces a quantum effect on local space-time. That the universe literally bends toward the choices of the people in it, when those choices are made against sufficient odds. He was very quiet. Yes, I buried it because it meant that we matter, individually, in the equations, and I didn't know what to do with that. Neither do I, Rick said. He looked at the aperture. The tears at its edges were small. Strange had them. The tribunal's signature on the scanner had stabilized, watching, waiting. If I step through, Rick said, my scanner data shows the tears will heal naturally within 72 hours. No further compounding, no systemic threat. He paused. The tribunal should stand down. Yes, Reed said, it should. And your universe will be exactly as it was. -1 temporary source of space-time stress and 1 unauthorized occupant. Yes. Rick looked at the aperture for a long moment. He looked at the scanner, the carrier wave, the 6 infinity stone signatures, the outliers, all of it. The universe, running hot, impossible, inexplicably sustained by a physical constant that should not exist. He drank from the flask. He put the flask in his coat. He looked at Reed Richards. "Your paper 4, he said. "The boundary condition problem. The wrong conclusion built on the correct methodology." "Yes. I wrote a correction. It's on the wall." Rick nodded at the wall behind them, where 11 days of notation were layered in 3 different marker colors. "The correct conclusion is marked in red. Everything else is working space." He paused. "Don't bury the corrected version." Reed looked at the wall. He looked at Rick. "I won't," he said. Rick nodded once. He looked at Tony. Tony, who had been quietly watching the entire exchange, raised his coffee cup in a small salute and said nothing, which was, Rick thought, the correct thing. He looked at Strange, who met his gaze with the particular expression of a man who had spent 9 days learning something that would not fit cleanly into any of his existing frameworks, and had decided to be grateful for the difficulty rather than resentful of it. He looked at the aperture. He stepped through. The aperture sealed behind him with a sound like an argument ending. The instruments registered the stepping stone transit, the portal gun's signal moving across the dimensional gradient toward the next intermediate constant, then the next. The 2 tiers at the aperture's former edges sat in the air for 6 seconds, then healed, drawing together and sealing with the particular neatness of space-time, correcting a small error. The instruments fell quiet. The lab was very still. Strange lowered his hands. Tony set down his coffee cup. Reed Richards stood facing the wall where 11 days of work were written in 3 colors of marker, the correct conclusion marked in red, the boundary condition problem solved in notation that was half a framework he recognized and half something he was going to need a new framework to fully read. Hill's voice came over the comlink from the observation room. "Confirmation on the transit?" Reed checked the instruments. "Confirmed. Signal progressing through the gradient. No anomalous signatures. No residual stress above natural healing threshold." A pause. "Good," Hill said. Her voice was measured and precise, and told nothing about whatever she was feeling, which was her particular genius. Reed stood at the wall for a long time. Tony came to stand beside him. He looked at the equations. He looked at the red-marked conclusion. He was quiet long enough that it was noticeable. "Could you understand it?" Reed asked. "If you studied it?" "Give me 6 months and a lot of coffee," Tony said. He paused. "Maybe less. It's good work. Insane, but good." He looked at the conclusion. "Is he right?" Reed looked at it. "Yes," he said. "He's right." "About which part?" Reed was quiet for a moment. "All of it." He touched the wall lightly, one finger against the red notation. "The boundary condition, the carrier wave, the source." He paused. "All of it. Somewhere between the physics constant of a universe that ran too hot to be possible and the physics constant of home, Rick Sanchez was threading apertures through the spaces between realities. The portal gun was doing what it had always done best, finding the doors, reading the edges, navigating the gradient by the accumulated data of 11 calibration attempts in a lab at the edge of the Greenland ice shelf. The stepping stones came and went, each one a brief existence in an intermediate space, a universe neither this one nor his, a point of transit, a breath between words. He did not stop at any of them. He was thinking about the carrier wave. He could still measure it on the scanner, faint, attenuating with distance from its source, but present. He could trace it back to its origin from anywhere in the gradient. He had the data. He could calculate it from any vantage point. He could calculate it. That was not the same as understanding it. Understanding it would require going back, staying longer, running more data, doing what Reed had said, spending time with the source, watching the choices being made, the unreasonable hope accumulating, the carrier wave being generated by individuals making decisions that cost them something, in directions they could not prove would work. He thought about that. He thought about Reed Richards standing at a wall full of equations at 3 in the morning, having spent 11 hours in conversation with the only person in the room who had kept up, saying, "I think of it as the people," saying, "That's why the work matters," meaning it, not as a performance, not as a comfort, but as a genuine conclusion reached by a correct methodology. He thought about that for a long time. The portal gun found the next stepping stone, the aperture opened, the new constant registered on the instruments, closer to home, one more transit, maybe two. Rick Sanchez stood at the threshold between one space and the next. He looked back at the scanner, the carrier wave, attenuating, still present, still measurable. He looked forward at the aperture and the next stepping stone and the gradient bending towards C137. He closed the aperture. He sat in the intermediate space, between universes, neither here nor there, and he drank from the flask. He looked at the scanner readings. He looked at the portal gun. He looked at the scanner readings again. "You are," he said to no one, to the space between realities, to the attenuating signal of a carrier wave produced by a universe that bent toward the choices of the people in it, a problem. He was talking to the data. He was talking to the conclusion marked in red. He was talking to the 11 hours and the covered walls and the flask and the expression on Reed Richards' face when Rick had told him his methodology was correct and his conclusion was right. He was talking to something he did not have a category for, something that had not appeared on any scanner in any of the 800 universes he had visited, something that registered only here, only in this gradient, only when he pointed the scanner back toward the universe he had just left. He sat for a long time, then he opened the aperture again. He pointed it at the next stepping stone. He stepped through. And in the lab at Site 7, on the wall where 11 days of work were written in 3 marker colors, the correct conclusion sat in red notation at the center of everything else. Reed Richards' boundary condition problem finally solved. It would take him 4 years to fully build the theoretical apparatus to support that conclusion properly, to reconstruct the framework from the working space of the equations around it, to turn what was marked in red into something he could publish without burying. When he finally did publish it, the paper ran to 41 pages and included, in the acknowledgements section, a single line that no one who read it fully understood. For the traveler who looked at the data and stayed anyway, however briefly, "You know what the constant means. I hope you find your way back to study it properly." The paper described, in the language of theoretical physics, a measurable quantum effect produced by collective volition. It described the mechanism by which unreasonable hope, enacted at cost against unfavorable odds, produces a persistent signal in local spacetime. It described the carrier wave, its origin, its propagation, its physical consequences for the universe that contained it. It described, in the rigorous and unsparing language of mathematics, why people matter. Individually, in the equations, why the choices made against the odds by individuals who cannot prove the odds will bend them anyway. Reed Richards did not bury this one, and somewhere in the gradient between one constant and another, threading apertures through the spaces that existed between all possible versions of the real, Rick Sanchez carried the scanner data from a universe he had not meant to visit and could not fully leave. The readings ran constantly, the carrier wave attenuated with distance. He was measuring it from further away now, from stepping stones that were moving toward home, and the signal was weaker at this range, but it was present. It was always present. He had been in 800 universes. He had measured every constant, visited every flavor of entropy, catalogued the forces and the endings and the things that waited at the edges of all organized matter. He had looked directly at everything. He had never measured anything like this. He did not know what to do with that. He had said so to an interrogation room and meant it. He had said so to a scanner at 3 in the morning and meant it more. But he had the data. He would always have the data. In every universe he subsequently visited, in every calibration he subsequently ran, in every lab and every flask and every 2-hour maintenance sleep at a workbench, the scanner would be running and the carrier wave would not appear, because no other universe produced it, and the absence would be a record of where it had been present. You cannot prove you remember a universe, but you can measure what is missing from every universe that is not it. In the grim mathematics of a man who had spent 100 lifetimes building proofs that hope was the universe's most elegant self-deception, something new was written now in the margins, in notation that used both his framework and a corrected version of another man's, marked in red. The proof was incomplete, the methodology was ongoing, the universe in question was still running, still hot, still sustained by a constant that should not exist, still producing its carrier wave from the choices of people who kept choosing, against every odds calculation, in the direction of something they could not prove would work. Rick Sanchez went home. He left behind 11 days of equations. He left behind a sealed aperture and 7 healed tears and a scanner frequency that Reed Richards would spend 4 years learning to build instruments to measure. He left behind an AIM biochemist who had confessed completely to a SHIELD director in the 40 minutes after Rick had correctly identified every component of his serum, because there is a specific kind of despair that comes from being the second smartest person in a room you thought you were the smartest person in. He left behind a corrected schema in Loki's possession, which Loki would spend 6 months choosing not to use, for reasons he did not examine closely, because examining them would require admitting that a man who had fallen through the floor of reality and stayed for 11 days before leaving without any leverage or gain whatsoever, had suggested, by the fact of his departure alone, that some things were better left alone. He left behind a carrier wave that would keep running without him, generated by the people in a universe that bent toward their choices. He left behind the only proof, in all the universes he had visited, that the most successful self-deception the cosmos had ever evolved might not be a deception at all. And in the spaces between realities, threading home through the gradient of constants between one universe and another, the smartest man in any room he had ever occupied was, for the first time in 60 subjective years, genuinely uncertain about a conclusion. He was certain about the data. He was uncertain about what it meant to have it. That uncertainty, precise and irreducible and not yet solvable, was the most honest thing Rick Sanchez had felt in a very long time, and it followed him through every aperture, through every stepping stone, through every intermediate constant between the universe that had produced him and the universe he had not expected, toward home. The carrier wave attenuated, the distance grew, the signal faded. But it did not disappear. Not yet. Not entirely. And in a universe that ran too hot to be possible, sustained by a physics constant that had no name yet in any framework except a red notation on a wall at a black site off the coast of Greenland, people kept making choices that cost them something, in directions they could not prove would work. The tribunal, observing, found no systemic threat. The stones held their silence in their scattered containments. The outliers went on doing what outliers do in a universe that bends toward them, catching the world each time it falls. None of them knew the carrier wave had a name now. None of them knew that somewhere in the gradient between one constant and another, a man with a scanner had measured them, all of them, individually, in the equations, and found the reading genuinely irreducible. The universe kept producing the signal. The signal kept carrying. And somewhere between everything he had proven and the single thing he could not disprove, Rick Sanchez went home carrying the most dangerous thing in any universe he had ever entered. Not a weapon, not a theorem, not a cosmic-grade entropy concentration, but a question he did not yet have an answer for. Whether that answer, when it came, would destroy the proof or complete it, remained to be seen. In the grim mathematics of infinite realities, where every universe ended, and every constant eventually entropied to silence, a carrier wave kept running in the one place it had ever been measured, and the man who had measured it was not finished. He was never finished. He would be back. He would be back.